Fort Smith, Arkansas. Midnight, 1882. A folded piece of paper slides under the door of Judge Isaac Parker's home. His wife finds it at dawn, her hands trembling as she reads the words scrawled in crude handwriting. "Stop the hangings or your family burns." The note isn't signed. It doesn't need to be. Everyone in the territory knows who's behind these threats. Confederate sympathizers, outlaw gangs, Klan remnants, all of them united by one thing. They want the hanging judge dead. What happens next will be erased from American memory for over a century. Because within 72 hours, the men who wrote that threat will be staring down the barrel of a gun held by the most dangerous lawman in American history, a black deputy marshal named Bass Reeves. And he didn't come to negotiate. Here's what they never taught you in school. The Wild West wasn't won by white cowboys with quick draws and good hearts. It was won by black lawmen who did the jobs nobody else would do. Men who rode into territory so dangerous that white deputies refused the assignments. Men who arrested thousands of criminals, faced down armed gangs, and never once wavered. And the greatest of them all was a former slave who became the most feared marshal in frontier history. His name was Bass Reeves. And this is the story they buried, because it proved everything they wanted you to believe about the Old West was a lie. Let me take you back to understand how we got here. The year is 1875, and the Indian Territory is the most lawless place in America. We're talking about 74,000 square miles of wilderness, covering what is now eastern Oklahoma. This isn't just remote land. This is where every murderer, horse thief, whiskey runner, and wanted criminal in the country comes to hide. There's no local law enforcement, no sheriffs, no police. Federal authority barely exists beyond the walls of Fort Smith. Outlaws call it the land of the six-shooter because justice comes from whoever draws fastest. Into this chaos steps Isaac Charles Parker, a 36-year-old federal judge appointed by President Ulysses Grant. Parker arrives in Fort Smith on May 2, 1875, and what he finds disgusts him. The previous court was so corrupt that murderers walked free after paying bribes. Witnesses were intimidated into silence. The few deputies who tried to enforce the law were killed without consequence. Parker looks at this broken system and makes a decision that will define the next 21 years of his life. He will bring order to the territory, no matter the cost, no matter the threats. Think about what Parker was facing. In his first session on the bench, he tries 91 defendants. 18 of them are charged with murder. He convicts 15 and sentences 8 to death. 8 men hanged in a single session. The newspapers go wild. They start calling him the hanging judge, and they mean it as a criticism. But Parker doesn't care about newspaper opinions. He cares about one thing: making the Indian Territory safe for the people who live there. And most of those people, the ones being murdered and robbed and terrorized, are Native Americans and black settlers who have no one else to protect them. But here's the problem. Parker can issue all the warrants he wants from his courtroom in Fort Smith. Somebody still has to ride into that wilderness and arrest the criminals. Somebody has to track murderers through 74,000 square miles of forests and plains and mountains. Somebody has to face down armed gangs who would rather die shooting than hang from Parker's gallows. White deputies keep dying or quitting. The job is too dangerous. The territory is too vast. The criminals are too ruthless. Parker needs a different kind of lawman. He needs someone who knows the territory better than anyone alive. Someone who can track a man through rain and darkness. Someone who fears nothing and no one. He finds Bass Reeves. And everything changes. Bass Reeves was born into slavery in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. Let that sink in for a moment. This man spent the first 25 years of his life as property. He was owned by a state legislator named William Reeves, who later became a colonel in the Confederate Army. When the Civil War erupts, Bass is forced to accompany his master to battle as a personal servant. But sometime during the war, Bass escapes. The exact circumstances are lost to history. Some accounts say he beat his master in a dispute and fled to avoid punishment. Others say he simply seized the chaos of war as his chance at freedom. What we know for certain is where he went. Bass Reeves fled into the Indian Territory and lived among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations for years. He learned their languages. He learned to track game through impossible terrain. He learned to survive in wilderness that killed lesser men. He became such an expert marksman that legends spread about his shooting abilities. They said he could shoot a running rabbit from horseback. They said he once shot a button off a man's coat at 500 yards. Whether every story is true doesn't matter. What matters is that when Bass Reeves finally emerged from the territory after the war, he knew that land better than any white lawman ever could. Have you ever wondered why certain stories disappear from history while others get told forever? It's not random. Stories get erased when they threaten the people who write the textbooks. And the story of Bass Reeves threatened everything white America wanted to believe about itself. In 1875, when Judge Parker puts out the call for deputy marshals willing to work the Indian Territory, Bass Reeves answers. He's 37 years old. He stands over 6 feet tall. He weighs nearly 200 pounds of solid muscle. He speaks multiple Native American languages. He knows every trail, every hideout, every water source in the territory. And he's a freed black man in a world where most people like him are still being terrorized by the Klan. Parker doesn't hesitate. He pins the badge on Reeves personally. It's one of the most consequential decisions in the history of American law enforcement. Over the next 32 years, Bass Reeves will arrest more than 3,000 felons. He'll kill 14 outlaws in the line of duty. He'll be shot at countless times. And he'll never be wounded once. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because right now, in 1882, there's a death threat sitting on Judge Parker's desk, and somebody has to answer it. The threat against Parker isn't the first, and won't be the last. Since taking the bench, he's received dozens of them. Anonymous letters promising to burn his house. Whispered warnings from informants about assassination plots. Drunken outlaws in saloons boasting about how they're going to kill the hanging judge. Most judges would have requested a transfer by now. Most would have started softening their sentences, hoping to appease the criminals threatening their families. Parker does the opposite. Every threat makes him harder. Every warning makes him more determined. He increases the frequency of hangings. He expands the reach of his deputies. He treats each threat not as a personal matter, but as a crime against the United States government itself. This particular threat is different, though. It's not just about Parker. It mentions his family. His wife, Mary. His 2 sons. The men who wrote it know where he lives, know his family's routines, know enough to make the threat credible. And they've made a crucial mistake. They've connected themselves to a network of outlaws already wanted on federal warrants. Parker recognizes the handwriting pattern from previous threats. He knows which gang is behind it. A loose confederation of whiskey runners, murderers, and Klan-affiliated night riders who've been terrorizing settlements throughout the territory. Parker calls in his chief marshal. He wants warrants issued immediately, not just for threatening a federal judge, but for every outstanding crime these men have committed. Murder, armed robbery, illegal whiskey sales, horse theft. By the time the paperwork is done, there are warrants for 7 men. And Parker has one instruction. Send Bass Reeves. If you're enjoying learning about this hidden chapter of American history, subscribe now. This is the kind of story that needs to be told, and you can help make sure it reaches more people. Reeves receives his orders within hours. 7 warrants. 7 dangerous men scattered across hundreds of miles of territory. Any other deputy would assemble a posse, maybe a dozen armed men, before attempting such an arrest. Reeves reads the warrants, folds them carefully, and rides out alone. This isn't arrogance. This is strategy. A large posse is loud, slow, and impossible to hide. Reeves knows that his greatest advantages are speed and surprise. The outlaws won't expect a single lawman to come for them. They certainly won't expect a black lawman. Here's something the history books completely ignore about Bass Reeves. The man was a master of disguise. We're not talking about putting on a fake mustache. We're talking about complete character transformations that would impress Hollywood stunt coordinators. Reeves would dress as a tramp, a cowboy, a farmer, a preacher, even a woman on occasion. He would change his voice, his walk, his entire demeanor. He would approach wanted criminals in plain sight, sometimes sharing meals with them or camping beside them, gathering information while they had no idea they were sitting next to the most dangerous marshal in the territory. For this particular hunt, Reeves adopts the disguise of a drifter. Ragged clothes, dirty face, a tired horse. He rides into outlaw camps and shares whiskey with criminals, listening to their boasts and gossip. Within 2 days, he knows exactly where the men who threatened Parker are hiding. They're holed up at a cabin about 40 miles from Fort Smith, celebrating what they think is a successful intimidation campaign. They believe the hanging judge will back down now. They believe their threats have won. They have no idea what's coming. Think about the psychology here. These men have spent their whole lives believing that power flows from violence. They've threatened, murdered, and terrorized their way through the territory. They've seen corrupt officials buckle under pressure. They've watched frightened citizens look away rather than confront them. They genuinely believe that a written threat against a judge's family will produce results. And why wouldn't they believe that? It's worked before. Other judges have transferred out. Other prosecutors have dropped charges. The system has always bent when they pushed it. But they've never pushed against Isaac Parker. And they've never met Bass Reeves. Reeves approaches the cabin just before dawn on the 3rd day after receiving his orders. The outlaws are sleeping, confident in their safety. Why would they worry? They're 40 miles from Fort Smith in territory that swallows lawmen whole. Their lookout is passed out drunk by the cold fire. Their horses are hobbled 100 yards from the cabin. They've done this a dozen times before. Hide out, let the heat die down, move on to the next crime. It's always worked. Reeves dismounts about 500 yards out and moves forward on foot. He's carrying his Winchester rifle, twin Colt revolvers, and handcuffs for 7 men. He weighs his options. The cabin has 1 door and 2 windows. If he gives them warning, they'll grab their guns, and this becomes a shooting situation. He's faced those odds before and won. But his orders are to bring them in alive if possible. Parker wants these men to stand trial. He wants them to hear the charges read aloud in open court. He wants the whole territory to see that threatening a federal judge results in federal punishment. So Reeves does something that demonstrates either incredible courage or complete insanity. He walks up to the front door and knocks. Can you imagine? You're an outlaw who just threatened to burn a federal judge's family alive. You're hiding out in a remote cabin, convinced that nobody knows where you are. And at dawn, there's a polite knock at your door. You open it and find a 6-foot black man in a deputy marshal's badge, reading your arrest warrant aloud like he's delivering mail. The leader of the group goes for his gun. Reeves is faster. The outlaw finds himself staring down the barrel of a Colt revolver before his hand touches the grip of his own weapon. Stand down or die, Reeves says calmly. Your choice. The man stands down. His 6 companions watch in disbelief as Reeves orders them one by one to step forward and be shackled. Nobody resists. How can you resist a man who just walked up to your hideout alone and captured you before breakfast? But here's where the story gets really interesting. Reeves now has 7 prisoners, 7 horses, and a 40-mile ride back to Fort Smith through territory, crawling with the prisoners' friends and allies. Any of those allies could ambush them. The prisoners themselves could try to escape or overpower their single captor. A lesser lawman would have shot at least a few of them rather than risk the journey. Reeves doesn't consider that option for a second. He chains the prisoners together in a line. He ties the line to his own horse. He positions himself at the front where he can watch all 7 at once. And he begins the long ride back to Fort Smith. It takes 2 days. During those 2 days, Reeves barely sleeps. He feeds and waters his prisoners as required by law. He treats them with professional courtesy, even though they've threatened to murder a judge's family. And when they arrive at Fort Smith, he delivers all 7 men alive and unharmed. The reaction in the territory is immediate and electric. Word spreads from settlement to settlement, from saloon to saloon. The men who threatened the hanging judge are in custody. Bass Reeves brought them in alone. He walked up to their hideout and arrested them like it was nothing. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For years, outlaws had operated on the assumption that they could hide in the territory forever. They believed that one federal judge in Fort Smith couldn't possibly reach them across 74,000 square miles of wilderness. Bass Reeves just proved them wrong. If he can find 7 men hiding in a remote cabin and bring them back alive, he can find anyone. Now let me tell you about the trial, because this is where Parker's genius becomes clear. He doesn't just want to punish these men. He wants to send a message that will echo across the territory for years. He schedules the trial for the busiest session of his court, when the gallery will be packed with spectators, reporters, and other outlaws awaiting their own judgment. He wants everyone to see what happens when you threaten a federal judge. The 7 men are marched into the courtroom in chains. Bass Reeves stands at attention near the bench, his badge polished, his weapons holstered but visible. The message is clear without a word being spoken. This is the man who caught you. This is the man who will catch anyone else who tries what you tried. The lead defendant makes one last attempt at defiance, shouting that Parker has no right to try free men. Parker stares him down and responds with words that become legendary. In this courtroom, you are not free men. You are accused criminals who threatened the peace and dignity of the United States. And you will answer for it. The trial lasts 3 days. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant's own handwriting matches the threat letter. Witnesses testify to hearing them boast about their plan. By the end, 6 of the 7 are convicted on multiple counts. The 7th, a young man who prosecutors believe was merely present rather than an active participant, receives a reduced sentence. But the other 6 hear the words they've been dreading: death by hanging. Here's where I need to stop and ask you something. When you picture the Wild West, what do you see? Cowboys in white hats? Sheriffs having showdowns at high noon? John Wayne riding into town to save the day? That's the myth. That's what Hollywood sold you. The reality is that the Old West was won by men like Bass Reeves. Black lawmen who faced discrimination, death threats, and impossible odds, and kept riding anyway. Men who weren't celebrated in their time and were actively forgotten afterward. The Western film genre made hundreds of movies about fictional white heroes, while ignoring the real black heroes who actually lived these stories. Parker's court becomes the most efficient engine of justice in American frontier history. Between 1875 and 1896, he tries over 13,000 cases. He sentences 160 men to death, of whom 79 actually hang. Those numbers sound harsh until you understand the alternative. Before Parker, the Indian Territory averaged over 100 murders per year. Many victims were Native Americans, whose deaths weren't even investigated. Others were black settlers killed by night riders with impunity. Parker doesn't just punish criminals. He creates the first real system of justice the territory has ever known. And Bass Reeves is the instrument of that justice. Over his career, Reeves serves more federal warrants than any other deputy marshal in American history. Not the most for a black deputy, the most period, more than 3,000 arrests, countless miles ridden through the most dangerous territory in the country. He becomes so effective that outlaws start surrendering the moment they hear his name. Why fight? They've seen what happens to men who fight Bass Reeves. They've heard the stories. The man is unstoppable. But what makes Reeves truly remarkable isn't just his effectiveness. It's his integrity. In an era when law enforcement was routinely corrupt, when deputies took bribes and looked the other way, Reeves maintained an absolutely spotless record. He never took a bribe. He never abused a prisoner. He never shot anyone who wasn't actively trying to kill him. And in one famous case, he arrested his own son. I need to tell you about this because it reveals who Bass Reeves really was. In 1902, Reeves' son Benny gets into an altercation and kills his wife. Benny flees, knowing that murder warrants will be issued. He also knows that his father is the most successful marshal in the territory. Perhaps he believes his father will look the other way. Perhaps he doesn't think at all. But when the warrant for Benny Reeves arrives at Fort Smith, Bass requests the assignment personally. Other deputies offer to handle it. They understand how painful it would be to arrest your own son. Reeves refuses their offers. "This is my son," he says. "This is my responsibility." He tracks Benny down, arrests him, and brings him back for trial. Benny is convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Can you imagine making that choice? Your own child, your own blood, and you strap on your guns and ride out to bring him to justice? That's not just duty. That's a level of moral commitment that most people can't even comprehend. And it tells you everything about why Bass Reeves was the lawman he was. For him, the badge wasn't just a job. It was a sacred trust. The law applied to everyone equally, even his own family. If you've made it this far in the video, you're clearly someone who appreciates real history instead of Hollywood mythology. Subscribe now if you enjoyed this story. There are so many more hidden chapters of American history that deserve to be told. Let me return now to what happened after the hanging of the men who threatened Parker. Because their executions sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld that transformed the territory. Before Bass Reeves delivered those prisoners, threatening a judge was considered a legitimate outlaw tactic. Judges were soft targets. They had families to protect. They couldn't ride into the territory and defend themselves. A well-placed threat could persuade them to reduce sentences, delay trials, or simply look away from certain crimes. After the trial and executions, that calculation changed completely. Every outlaw in the territory learned a new lesson. Threaten the hanging judge, and Bass Reeves shows up at your door. That's not a risk. That's a death sentence. The statistics tell the story. In the years immediately following, threats against federal officials in the territory dropped by over 60%. Not because criminals suddenly developed respect for the law, because they developed fear of the consequences. And in the Wild West, fear of consequences was often the only thing that kept the peace. But here's the tragedy. Despite everything Bass Reeves accomplished, despite being the most successful lawman in American frontier history, he died in relative obscurity. When the territories became states, the U.S. Marshal Service was disbanded in favor of local police. Reeves, at age 67, had to take a job as a city policeman in Muskogee, Oklahoma. He walked a beat for 2 years before dying of kidney disease in 1910. There was no national recognition, no statue, no monument. His story faded into the margins of history, while fictional characters became legends. For almost 80 years, Bass Reeves was virtually unknown outside of small circles of Western historians. The movies made hundreds of films about white frontier heroes. Television shows invented countless fictional marshals who were based, often unconsciously, on Reeves' real exploits. But his name was never mentioned. His face was never shown. The most successful lawman in the Wild West was erased from popular memory because he was black. Think about that. We know the names of outlaws. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, the Dalton Gang. These criminals became American folk heroes. But the black lawman who arrested more criminals than any deputy in history, who never lost a fight, who served for 32 years without a single accusation of misconduct, he was forgotten. That's not an accident. That's a deliberate choice by the people who controlled what stories got told. The revival of Bass Reeves' legacy didn't begin until 1992, when a biography brought his story to broader attention. Since then, there's been growing recognition of his achievements. A bridge in Muskogee was named after him. A statue was erected in Fort Smith. In 2023, a major television series finally brought his story to millions of viewers. But we're still fighting against 80 years of erasure. And here's what that erasure cost us. Generations of black children grew up believing that the Old West was a white story. They never saw themselves in the frontier narrative. They never learned that black marshals, black cowboys, black settlers were essential to the building of the American West. That absence wasn't just unfair, it was a lie. And lies about history become lies about the present. If you believe that black Americans were passive victims waiting for white salvation, you don't understand how power and resistance actually work. Bass Reeves proved something that challenges comfortable narratives. He proved that when given equal authority and opportunity, black Americans excelled at the most demanding jobs in the country. He proved that a former slave could outperform every white deputy in the service. He proved that the mythology of white frontier heroism was exactly that, a mythology designed to exclude the people who didn't fit the preferred image. Let me bring this back to Judge Parker and what their partnership meant. For 21 years, a white judge from Ohio and a black deputy from Arkansas worked together to bring justice to a lawless territory. Parker never wavered in his support for Reeves. He sent him on the most dangerous assignments because he knew Reeves was the most capable lawman he had. He trusted a black man with his life, with his family's safety, with the enforcement of federal law. In an era of violent white supremacy, that partnership was revolutionary. And when Parker died in 1896, worn out from 2 decades of fighting crime and disease, Reeves was one of the mourners. The judge had defended Reeves against countless attacks from white citizens who couldn't accept a black man's authority. He had promoted Reeves when other officials wanted him dismissed. He had recognized that effectiveness mattered more than skin color. In the brutal mathematics of the frontier, Parker understood that a black deputy who arrested criminals was worth infinitely more than a white deputy who couldn't. So what's the lesson here? What does the story of Bass Reeves tell us about American history and American possibility? It tells us that the heroes we celebrate are chosen, not discovered. Bass Reeves was always a hero. His achievements were always real. The choice was made to forget him, to elevate fictional characters while burying factual ones. That choice tells us more about the people who made it than about Reeves himself. It tells us that excellence is not enough to overcome systemic erasure. Reeves was literally the best at his job. The objective statistics prove it. More arrests than any other deputy in history. A perfect record of integrity. Decades of service without a single proven complaint. And none of that protected him from being forgotten. Because the people who controlled historical memory didn't want his story told. It tells us that the past is always political. The stories we tell about the past shape how we understand the present. When Bass Reeves was erased, it reinforced the idea that black Americans were not builders of the nation, that they played no active role in taming the frontier, that they required white saviors rather than producing their own heroes. Recovering his story doesn't just correct a historical record. It challenges a whole framework of assumptions. And finally, it tells us that resistance to injustice takes many forms. Bass Reeves never led a protest. He never gave political speeches. He simply did his job with such excellence that his existence itself was a refutation of white supremacy. Every outlaw he arrested, every criminal he brought to justice, every mile he rode through that dangerous territory was an act of defiance against a system that said black men couldn't hold authority over white ones. The next time someone tells you that the Wild West was a white story, remember Bass Reeves. Remember a former slave who became the greatest lawman in American history. Remember a black deputy who walked up to armed outlaws and arrested them with calm professional authority. Remember a father who arrested his own son because the law applied to everyone equally. Remember 32 years of service, more than 3,000 arrests, and a legacy that was deliberately buried for 80 years. Remember that when outlaws threatened the hanging judge, they expected fear, they expected retreat, they expected the system to buckle under pressure like it always had. Instead, they got Bass Reeves at their door before dawn, warrant in hand, ready to deliver them to justice. They threatened the hanging judge. Bass Reeves delivered the answer himself, and that answer echoed across the territory for decades, teaching every outlaw the same lesson. You can run into the wilderness. You can hide in remote cabins. You can threaten and intimidate and terrorize. But there is a man riding out there who will find you. And when he finds you, you will answer for everything. That's the real Wild West. That's the history they didn't want you to know. That's the legacy of Bass Reeves. And now you know it too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this story, and share it with someone who needs to hear about the real heroes of American history. Because their names deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told. And their achievements deserve to finally take their rightful place in our national memory.